It was supposed to be an ordinary flight across the United States, with passengers settling into their seats, flight attendants going through their safety routines, and the hum of the engines filling the cabin. But midway through the journey, an unexpected moment changed everything. A young girl, no older than 10, timidly handed a crumpled piece of paper to one of the flight attendants. At first glance, it seemed like just a child's note, but as the attendant read its contents, their expression turned serious. Without hesitation, they rushed to the cockpit. Moments later, the pilot made an urgent announcement. The flight would be making an emergency landing. The flight attendants' hands trembled slightly as they gripped the note. Their training had prepared them for emergencies, but this was different. The words scrawled on the crumpled paper were alarming. "Help me. He's not my dad." The attendant's heart pounded. Glancing at the little girl, they noticed her wide, fearful eyes darting toward the man sitting beside her. He appeared calm, oblivious to the growing tension. Trying to act naturally, the attendant forced a polite smile and asked the girl, "Are you okay, sweetheart?" The man's grip on the girl's wrist tightened ever so slightly. That was enough. The attendant quickly excused themselves and headed straight to the cockpit, briefing the captain in hushed tones. Within minutes, the decision was made. Protocol dictated that the flight had to land immediately. The pilots contacted air traffic control, requesting an emergency diversion to the nearest airport. Meanwhile, the crew discreetly signaled to an undercover air marshal on board. The officer, blending in among the passengers, nodded in understanding and subtly positioned himself closer to the man and the girl, preparing for whatever might come next. As the plane began its descent, tension rippled through the cabin. Passengers sensed something was wrong, but no announcement was made. Only the urgent movements of the crew hinted at the unfolding situation. Would law enforcement arrive in time? And more importantly, was the girl truly in danger? Or was there another explanation waiting to unfold? As the plane began its descent, the flight attendant returned to the cabin, doing their best to remain calm. The little girl sat stiffly in her seat, her hands clasped in her lap. The man beside her seemed unfazed, staring out the window as if nothing were wrong. The undercover air marshal had quietly repositioned himself a few rows behind them, keeping a close watch. Meanwhile, another flight attendant discreetly alerted a colleague to prepare for law enforcement's arrival upon landing. Minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unexpected situation, we will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the flight crew." Passengers murmured in confusion, but most assumed it was a mechanical issue or a medical emergency. The man next to the little girl showed no reaction until he noticed two flight attendants standing nearby, subtly blocking the aisle. As soon as the plane touched down and taxied to a remote part of the tarmac, flashing blue and red lights came into view. Law enforcement vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Within moments, officers boarded the plane, moving with quiet precision. The man stiffened, his fingers twitching on the armrest. "Sir," one of the officers said firmly, "we need you to come with us." The entire cabin fell silent. The little girl shrank in her seat, eyes darting between the officers and the man beside her. Then, for the first time, the man spoke. "She's my daughter," he said, his voice even. "This is a misunderstanding." One of the officers knelt beside the girl, speaking gently. "Sweetheart, do you know this man? Do you want to go with him?" The girl hesitated. Her lower lip trembled. Then, in a barely audible voice, she whispered, "No." The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Officers moved in swiftly, restraining the man before he could react. The little girl was gently led away by another officer, who wrapped a blanket around her small shoulders. As the man was escorted off the plane, a collective breath of relief rippled through the cabin. But for the flight attendant who had received the note, one question still lingered. Who was this man, and how had he managed to get this far with her? As the officers led the man off the plane, the little girl clung to the officer's arm, her small frame trembling. She had been silent throughout the ordeal, but now that she was away from the man, her eyes welled with tears. The flight attendants watched from the cabin as law enforcement secured the perimeter. Some passengers craned their necks, whispering among themselves, but no one fully understood what had just happened. Outside, officers placed the man in handcuffs and escorted him to a waiting patrol car. His expression remained neutral, neither panicked nor angry, but he no longer had control over the situation. Inside the airport, FBI agents and Child Protective Services were already waiting. The little girl was taken to a quiet room away from the crowd, where a female agent knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, you're safe now," she said softly. "Can you tell us your name?" The girl hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward the door as if afraid the man might suddenly reappear. "It's okay," the agent reassured her. "He can't hurt you." A long silence followed before the girl finally whispered, "Sophie." The agent smiled gently. "Hi, Sophie. My name is Agent Turner. Can you tell me, do you know that man? Is he really your dad?" Sophie shook her head. "Do you know where your real parents are?" Another shake. Agent Turner exchanged a glance with her colleague. They had seen cases like this before: trafficking, abduction, illegal custody disputes. Whatever the truth was, Sophie was at the center of something deeply disturbing. Meanwhile, back on the plane, the flight attendant who had received Sophie's note was speaking with another officer. "She didn't say a word when she gave me the note," the attendant explained. "She just looked scared." "You did the right thing," the officer assured them. "That note might have saved her life." As the passengers were finally allowed to disembark, the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. The flight that was supposed to be routine had turned into something far more serious. Now, the real investigation was just beginning. Who was the man claiming to be Sophie's father? And where had she really come from? As the airport bustled with passengers moving to their gates and rebooking flights, a team of investigators worked swiftly behind the scenes. The man who had been detained was taken to an interrogation room, while Sophie was placed under the care of Child Protective Services. The man sat at the table, his hands cuffed in front of him. His demeanor remained calm, almost eerily so. Across from him, an FBI agent placed a file on the table. "You want to tell us who you really are?" the agent asked. The man exhaled slowly. "I already told you. Her name is Sophie, and she's my daughter." The agent leaned forward. "Then why did she write a note asking for help?" No response. The agent continued, flipping open the file. "We ran your prints. You're not listed as Sophie's guardian. and you have no legal connection to her. He slid a photograph forward. Do you know who this is? For the first time, the man hesitated. It was a picture of a woman, mid-30s, tired eyes, an expression of quiet worry. The agent watched his reaction closely. Her name is Lisa Reynolds. She reported her daughter missing 2 weeks ago. The man's jaw tightened. Sophie sat curled up in a chair, hugging the blanket around her. A social worker gently handed her a cup of hot chocolate. "You're doing great, Sophie," she said. "Can you tell me anything about how you got on that plane?" Sophie hesitated, stirring the drink with her spoon. Then, in a small voice, she said, "He told me I had to come with him. He said my mom was sick and needed me." The social worker's heart sank. "Did you believe him?" Sophie nodded. "At first. But then I tried to call my mom, and he wouldn't let me. That's when I knew something was wrong." Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought no one would help me." The social worker gently touched her hand. "But someone did." The agent wasn't backing down. Lisa Reynolds, Sophie's mom, says she last saw her daughter when she let her visit her father for the weekend. That was 2 weeks ago. She hasn't heard from her since. He let the words sink in. "You're not her father. So who are you?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "You wouldn't understand." The agent's voice hardened. "Try me." Silence filled the room. Then the man finally spoke, his voice low. "She doesn't belong with her mother." The agent exchanged a look with his partner. This was about more than a custody dispute. This was something darker. And they were running out of time to find out what it was. Agent Turner walked into the conference room where her team was piecing together the case. A whiteboard was already filled with notes. Victim: Sophie Reynolds, 9 years old. Missing since 2 weeks ago. Last seen with biological father Michael Reynolds. Suspect: unknown male, claiming to be her father. "We got confirmation from Lisa Reynolds," an analyst reported. "She has full custody. She let Sophie visit her ex-husband for the weekend, but when it was time to return, he never showed up. No calls, no messages. She filed a missing persons report 3 days later." Turner frowned. "But this guy isn't Michael Reynolds." "No, and that's where it gets weird." The analyst pulled up a document on the screen. "We ran his fingerprints. He's using a stolen identity. Real name, David Cole. Multiple fraud charges, some minor run-ins with the law, but nothing related to kidnapping until now." Turner's eyes narrowed. "So if he's not her father, how did he get her?" David Cole sat on the cot, staring at the ceiling. He knew they were digging into his past, trying to connect the dots. But they wouldn't find what they were looking for. Because the truth wasn't in their system. A guard opened the door. "You have a visitor." Cole sat up, expecting another round of questioning. But when the door opened, he froze. A man in a dark suit stepped inside. He wasn't FBI. He wasn't local law enforcement. But Cole recognized him immediately. The man spoke calmly. "You were supposed to get her out quietly." Cole swallowed hard. "I didn't have a choice. She wrote that note." The man's expression didn't change. "And now the feds are involved." Cole exhaled sharply. "It's over." The man shook his head. "Not yet. But you need to keep your mouth shut." Cole clenched his fists. What about the girl? A cold smile. We'll take care of it. Sophie had been moved to a secure location under FBI protection. She was still shaken but beginning to open up. Agent Turner sat across from her. Sophie, do you remember anything about where he took you after you left your dad's house? Sophie nodded slowly. We drove for a long time. Then we stayed in a house with other kids. Turner's stomach tightened. Other kids. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. I don't think they were allowed to leave. Turner exchanged a glance with the child psychologist in the room. This wasn't just an abduction. They had just uncovered something much bigger. And Sophie might be the key to stopping it. Agent Turner and her team worked through the night, piecing together Sophie's testimony with the evidence they had gathered. The mention of other kids sent a wave of urgency through the investigation. If Sophie had been taken to a larger operation, there could be more victims still in danger. A forensic analyst entered the room with an update. We went through traffic camera footage from the day Sophie disappeared. Her father's house is in Portland, but after she was taken, she was driven south for hours. We tracked a vehicle matching the description Sophie gave. It made a stop at an isolated property in rural California. Turner leaned in. Who owns it? The analyst hesitated. It's a shell company, but we traced it back to a known trafficking network. And get this, David Cole has ties to them. Turner's jaw clenched. That's our lead. We need a raid team on that property now. Just before dawn, a joint task force of FBI agents and local law enforcement surrounded the property. Armed officers moved in swiftly, breaching the front entrance. Inside, they found evidence of a larger operation. Children's clothes, fake IDs, and phones filled with encrypted messages. But the biggest discovery was in the basement. For children, frightened, malnourished, but alive. Agents moved quickly, freeing them and securing the area. Among the children was a little boy who clung to an agent's hand and whispered, "Is Sophie safe?" Turner, who had just arrived on the scene, knelt beside him. "Yes, she's safe, and so are you now." Back at the detention center, David Cole sat in his cell, knowing his time was up. The FBI had connected him to the trafficking ring, and his only way out was to cut a deal. When Agent Turner entered, she didn't waste time. "We got the kids. We know everything. But there are more people involved, and you're going down for this unless you talk." Cole hesitated. He had followed orders his whole life, but now, sitting in that cold cell, he realized something. He was expendable to the people he worked for. "I'll talk," he finally muttered. "But I want a deal." Turner nodded. "Then start talking." Days later, Sophie was reunited with her mother in an emotional embrace. Lisa Reynolds couldn't stop crying as she held her daughter close. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I promise." Meanwhile, with Cole's testimony and the evidence gathered from the raid, the FBI launched a full-scale operation against the trafficking network. Dozens of arrests followed, shutting down one of the most dangerous rings on the West Coast. As for Sophie, her courage had saved not just herself, but others who had been trapped in a nightmare. And for the flight attendant who first saw her desperate plea for help, it was a reminder that sometimes the smallest note can change everything.